Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Stuart Wolpert. Sara Melzer is a Humanities Professor Emeritus with expertise in French literature. But today we're not talking about France and we're not talking about literature. She's a certified mindfulness coach with wise insights about how mindfulness can improve our relationships and our lives. She's currently writing 2 books about mindfulness, and she integrates mindfulness techniques in her teaching. So we're very fortunate to have with us, and please join me in welcoming Professor Sara Melzer. Thank you very much, Sara. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Stuart. It's wonderful to be here, and thank everyone for coming. Before we get started, I thought that I would do an exercise with you that I do before I teach just about every class. So I would like you for just a couple of minutes to close your eyes. And if you have tea or something to eat, that's fine, and you can continue eating. But what I would like you to do is to just close your eyes for 1 minute. You take a deep breath. And I want you to close the mental door behind you, because you've all been busy getting here, going through traffic or talking with friends or doing something else. And very often we are living in what happened before the event. So I want you to close that mental door behind you to arrive here in this moment, in this room at the UCLA Faculty Center. And the best way to arrive is to feel your body, because your body can only be in the present. It's not, your mind can time travel, but your body is present. And so what you might do is just anchor your awareness and settle in. By contacting your body, one good way is to scrunch your toes and feel your connectedness to the floor, to the ground, to the earth. And that lets you know you are here in this chair, in this part of the room, at this moment of time. Or you can wiggle your bottom on the chair, again, to let yourself know you are here. Or feel your back against the chair. And for just a moment, tune into those physiological sensations in your body that let you know you are here, not elsewhere. I'd now like you to turn your attention to the sounds in the room, any sound, close or far, or notice the silence. Or if you'd like to eat, you can eat, but pay attention to whatever it is you're eating. Just try to pay attention to their sounds or to the silence. The silence is a sound. And you might notice, what are the sounds closest to you? And what are the sounds farthest away from you? And that's included. Cell phone sounds are part of the environment, but we just allow them to be there. I would now like you to set your intention for the rest of this session to find 3 interesting things that happened that will happen in the session. Whatever is interesting to you, just be on the lookout for it. And make a mental note of it and move on.
I hope we'll have more than 3, but okay. 3.
Yes.
So before we get started, let me just ask, how many of you are engaged in mindfulness or have had a mindfulness practice in the past? Okay, about half or so. Good, good. Well, I have many questions for you. I'm really happy to have you here. Professor Melzer and I have talked about mindfulness before, and one of the things that I've learned and that surprised me is that I kind of thought mindfulness was mostly involved in trying to improve your focus, your concentration. But you say it's much more than that. So before we get into anything else, and I've got many questions, tell us first what mindfulness is and what the benefits are.
Great. Okay, I will get to a definition of mindfulness, but as a way into it, I'd like to tell 2 complementary stories that I think illuminate it and give you a more succinct or perhaps abstract definition of it. The first story was when I had the world's best massage. I was up at Esalen and I snagged this great world-famous masseuse, masseur, and I was right by the ocean, and I was in total heaven with this good fortune of this massage. I don't know how long I was actually having the massage because I was so absorbed in it, I completely lost track of the whole time. But what I do know is that at a certain point, I began to wonder, how long would it last? Where was I? Was it half over? Was it about to end? Maybe, would this guy be free tomorrow? And then I was checking my mental schedule. Maybe I could have an appointment with him the next day. And so the rest of my massage, I was totally consumed with my plans for how I could get another version of what I already had. And so this is an example of how we often get lost when we have something that is really desirable and pleasurable. We get lost in an imagined future that never arrives, and we are unable to appreciate what is already present in our lives.
Well, that's very interesting. I know you want to say, but is there a way you could have pushed those thoughts aside and got back to the massage?
That's where I'm going.
Okay.
And that's absolutely where I'm going, because that's the whole point, is to sort of figure out what is the problem, and then how do we fix this problem. Fix, not quite the right word, but manage our attention so that we don't go into this automatic pilot of trying to plan something that we already have. It's sort of like, you're eating, or if you're eating a cookie, and then you see there's another cookie on the plate, but there's not enough for everybody, and you kind of gobble down the one you have, so you get the next one. And anyway, so the second story that I want to tell is the reverse situation of this. I had a stomach bug, and I was unable to eat anything other than measly toast and tea. And at first, I was consumed by food envy and self-pity, eyeing everybody else's plates, this delicious salmon and souffle, etc., etc. And then I decided, rather than suffer my food envy, I could eat my toast mindfully. So what I did was I did it very slowly and carefully. I took each bite, it was a small bite, and I could feel the texture of the toast. It had the right amount of crunchiness for my taste. I'm going to be very particular about some things. And so I felt I had the pleasure of that texture of that toast on my tongue. And then I taste, and it had a nice smell and a kind of Proustian moment. It reminded me of being a kid, and my mother tended to me by giving me toast. And so it had that kind of pleasure. And I tasted the sourdough, which was my favorite kind of bread. And when I chewed it, I paid careful attention to the texture of the toast, so that it was crunchy at first, but then when I bit into it, the texture changed into a delicious mush, and then that mush would kind of make its way down, and the flavors were surprisingly varied, sort of, they weren't monotone, or not monotones, monolithic. They had flavors within flavors, and then I felt a kind of soothing quality as it went down my esophagus. So because of the way I ate the simple toast, I was as satisfied and full as any 4-star restaurant food. The major point I want to make in both of these stories is that the quality of my experience does not depend on any external circumstances. In the first example, I had great external circumstances. World-class masseur in a world-class place. I was on vacation, no deadlines, no pressures, everything designed to promote my happiness. But I wasn't present for my so-called happiness because my attention was elsewhere, planning to have another version of what I already had. Then in the second instance, the external circumstances were not very good. I had dull, boring toast. How exciting is that? But yet, because of the quality of attention that I put on that toast and the way I ate it, I felt fulfilled and satisfied and happiness. So, the key point here is that it is something internal to me, the quality of my attention that matters. And we all have more choices in how we pay attention than we realize. And so this is to answer the question of what is mindfulness. Mindfulness is a form of attention training so that we realize we have more choices in what we pay attention to. And the choices we make shape our experience. And they also determine whether we find suffering or happiness in a given activity. So that, because we are, in our culture, we are taught to believe by advertisers that the happiness is, of course, always outside of us, and it resides in the product that someone wants to sell us, or some kind of experience that they want to give us. But, and we, if we are mindless, we buy into that, literally and figuratively. But in truth, what really matters is what's going on inside of us. And we can determine whether we experience something as positive or negative.
Well, I like those two stories, and now I'd like to tell two brief stories. I retired about 1.5 years ago, and when I was working here at UCLA, I often worked late, and I'd see the custodian would work the evening shift, and he was happier than anybody else that I'd seen. It seemed like he had a worse job than anybody. He had to be there until 2 a.m., and he was cleaning the bathrooms, cleaning the toilets, cleaning the entire building, and yet he was always smiling and singing and humming. He'd always greet you with a warm smile. I once asked him how he was able to do that, why he did that, and he said, "Oh, smiles are free. I can afford to give them to everybody." So anyway, he's a very good-natured man. The other one I want to mention is Bonnie and I were in Hawaii years ago, and we're in this paradise. It's beautiful, and I'm looking around, and it looks like most people aren't having that good a time. And there too, I saw a maintenance man in the hotel where we were working, and as with the custodian, he had a dirty job. The other people were on vacation, they were there to enjoy themselves. He had to, keep everything running smoothly, keep everything working. And again, he seemed to be in a better mood than all these people who were paying for the vacation. And I'm thinking, how is it that the people who are paying a lot of money are enjoying this less than this person who's got this job to do?
Those are great those are great stories, and that's really right on point, because we tend to think that the external circumstances of wealth or poverty or whatever shape our lived experience. But that's not true. I mean, that's what mindfulness teaches. It really depends on what you pay attention to and how. Now, to maybe make another point about mindfulness is that we tend to think that mindfulness is something special and extraordinary that only certain people can cultivate high on a mountaintop or something like that. But your example shows that some people develop it naturally through lots of different ways. And we all have mindful experiences naturally. If you ever think of a moment when you were really just thrilled doing something and you were so absorbed you didn't notice what time it was, and you were just there. And that is a naturally occurring experience that we all have. But the point that I want to make here is that we are often dependent on when we don't know why those moments come and go. And what mindfulness tries to do is to enable us to have those kinds of experiences all the time. And that's why it is important to practice. And someone like a janitor can have it. We don't know enough about him to know what he did to cultivate it. But if I were a scientist, I would go seek out that person and find out what they did to cultivate that attitude, because mindfulness is an attitude of smiling, for example. It's free, and if you do smile, you will notice physiological changes in your body. To smile at someone else makes you feel better and more connected. Yeah.
So you're saying that it's possible maybe to be mindful all the time, not just once in a while or a lot of the time.
Well, that's the idea.
That would be terrific. I wish I could be more.
Well, that is the idea.
Cool.
Which isn't to say that even the strongest meditator is that all the time, but most of the time.
So one thing I find interesting is that mindfulness dates back 2,600 years. Is that right? And yet, it seems to me we need it now more than ever, because everybody with social media, with the phones, you're talking to somebody, they're looking at their phone. So between social media, there's so many distractions. It seems more than ever that, as I say, we're not fully present, we're distracted, and there's a need for this 2,600-year-old mindfulness.
I think everybody, if you have not shut off your phone yet.
There are some ironies that here we're talking about mindfulness. One person walked in late to a mindfulness program, other people had their phones on. So clearly I think we all have some work to do. But maybe we're in the right place then.
Yeah.
But so tell us about, it's a 2,600-year-old practice, but it's evolved, right? And it's changed.
Right. The historical Buddha lived 2,600 years ago in India, and his teachings, I think he's the most brilliant philosopher that I've read.
Wow.
But and maybe in the past 40, 50 years, there's been a surge of interest in mindful awareness. And it's become very popular because it now has the cachet or the opprobrium of scientists to show that it's not all woo-woo, feel-good, happy, because people did not take it seriously until the scientists came in to do scans of people's brains and what happens to their nervous system, and neuroscience is full of validation that mindfulness actually changes your brain. It is not just something you do to feel good, but Rick Hansen in particular talks about how if you change, first of all, there's a concept called neuroplasticity, which means that your brain is not fixed as we used to think, but the brain has a kind of malleability or plasticity that changes in response to various stimuli, one of which is your attention. So that if you are used to, and this is, by the way, behind what I intended when I said at the very beginning of the session, set your intention to be on the lookout for 3 interesting things. Because sometimes we go to events and have a kind of show me attitude. And you think we're open, but we're really looking for what's wrong. And if you look for something that's wrong, you will find it. But if you look for something that's interesting, you will find it too. And you want to retrain your brain to always look for what is positive. And we've all learned to drive, I assume, because we live in Los Angeles. I remember when I was a kid, the most important piece of information in my driving lesson was, look at where you want to go, not where you don't want to go. Because if you look where you don't want to go, that's where you will unconsciously find yourself. And it's the same principle here. So you train your neuronal circuits to be on the lookout for what is interesting and positive, and that will recreate new habits so that you will do it automatically. And that will really help you.
Well, you've already said 3 interesting things, and we're just getting started. But let's go back to health. So mindfulness actually can improve your health. You were talking about the brain, and I think there are also studies indicating mindfulness can strengthen your immune system.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's a huge benefit. Okay, so tell us about, you're saying that happiness is connected to mindfulness, right?
I know we're going to get to before that, but I do want to say one further thing about what mindfulness is. There are many different ways of defining it. A lot of people say that it's about becoming more present to our experience. I find that vague, because I don't really know what that means.
It means pushing thoughts aside, doesn't it?
No, see, okay, so that's the, no, it doesn't.
It doesn't?
Not at all. To be, but anyway.
Okay.
But, because I don't want to go where, about this notion of presence. Because I think it is vague, or confusing. But I think what is more clear is if we think about mindfulness as training of our attention. And our attention is a mental muscle, and it needs to be educated, because we have no education at all for our attention. We just assume it's always there. But you would go to a mental gym. That's when we exercise. We go into a mental gym just the way people go to a physical gym to train their biceps and their triceps. But the goal is not to be in the gym all the time, because if you're only that way in the gym, what's the point? The point is you bring your buffed up muscles into your life, and it will help you. But the problem is we don't pay much attention to our attention. We don't even value it as one of our most important resources, because we just take it for granted. But advertisers know the value of our attention. They pay millions of dollars just to grab a few seconds of our attention, because they know those seconds of our attention are valuable and will shape us more than we realize. But we don't value our attention, so we allow it to be hijacked by advertisers, social media, phones, having the latest iPhone, etc., etc. And so mindfulness is a kind of valuing of our attention, and more importantly, a training of our attention. And I know the question you're going to ask, and I want to get into the question about how it would function, how our attention functions, because I think when I first heard about it, I had a very simple understanding of what it meant. But in fact, our attention has more dimensions and varieties than most people realize. And so, we kind of look at it as a kind of on-off switch. Either it's there or not there. Or we might have a more subtle understanding and say it's like a dimmer switch. There's degrees of it. But our attention is much more complex. And so that's what the attention training of mindfulness does.
Right. And I want to ask you also about multitasking, because that seems to be the opposite of mindfulness. You're trying to do 2 or 3 things simultaneously. You're not giving your full attention to any of them. And I might say that I found that I can't do it. So when I was working, sometimes I'd be out of the office for a while, I'd come back in, and I'd see I had both emails to read, and I had some phone messages. And so I try to simultaneously listen to the phone messages and read the emails. And I found out I wasn't concentrating on either, and then I had to do it all over a second time. This time, just concentrate on this email, just listen to this voicemail, because my brain couldn't process them both. And even in this room, we're talking for a while. What happens if some of the people start thinking, well, what they're going to be doing afterwards, and they've got these other commitments, and are they going to get there on time, and how's the traffic going to be? How do you push those thoughts aside and focus on what you're doing? In this case, listening to you.
Okay, let me first just add to what you said. Yes, there's lots of research which shows that it is not efficient. You do not do either of the activities sufficiently well. But there's another dimension which I have not seen mentioned in the study, but it's important. It doesn't measure the quality of your experience in doing something, because we tend to think about experiences in terms of a doing. Do we get this task done or not? And we totally forget, well, what's the quality of your experience? Are you enjoying it, or are you just doing a checklist? And if you do not multitask, there's a greater likelihood that you can find joy and pleasure in doing the simplest things, like weeding in a garden, which I happen to like. But I think that one of the things that mindfulness does is it focuses our attention on the lived experience of something, and to hopefully get more joy and pleasure in it, because we forget that there's joy and pleasure to be had. And it relies, as I said earlier, not on the external thing, but on what's inside of us and how we pay attention to whatever we're doing.
So you're saying that happiness is related to mindfulness?
Absolutely. And so what I thought I would do is say that the ultimate goal of mindfulness is happiness, but it is also, should be qualified as happiness independent of circumstances, which is even higher form. And I think your janitors are a perfect example of it, because our minds were thinking, with their circumstances, they shouldn't be so happy.
And yet they are, right.
Yeah, how come they're happy and I'm not, and so it's...
I mean, the famous UCLA basketball coach, John Wooden, had these different sayings, aphorisms, and one of them was, things tend to work out the best for people who make the best of the way things work out.
Oh, really? That's a great line.
Yeah. Okay, so you're saying happiness is related to mindfulness, is very related to mindfulness. Is love related to mindfulness?
Everything is related to mindfulness.
Wow.
There is nothing that is not related to mindfulness, because it is our most educated. I'll talk first about education, because we're in an educational system. Education relies on mindfulness, because our attention is the most important tool we have in learning. It is more important than learning to reason, think, read, write, 3 R's, because we can only reason and think on the basis of what we put inside the frame of our attention. So we can reason, but if we're reasoning about something that is limited, then the quality of our reasoning isn't good. So our attention is important for the reasoning process, the thinking process. And also attention, you can't learn without cultivating your attentional muscle. And I think the most prevalent disorder for kids is attentional deficit disorder.
Right.
And without your attention, you can't learn anything.
Oh, I see. So parents should encourage their children to do mindfulness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that a lot of elementary schools are now realizing that, and they are teaching it, but it could be more. But I think that certainly for college students, they suffer terribly from attentional deficit disorder.
Can mindfulness help us overcome emotional pain?
Absolutely, and that's exactly where I wanted to go.
You have an example, don't you?
Yes, I do. What I thought I would do is, since I made the comment that mindfulness is a kind of mental gym where we train our attention, but we don't really know what our attention is because we can't see it. And we don't even take advantage of most of it. So what I thought I would do is tell you a personal story that will illuminate how what we pay attention to and how first creates emotional suffering. And I will give you an example of my own emotional suffering. And then how I use my mindfulness skills to alleviate my emotional suffering. But just to sort of maybe skip back a teeny bit to the Buddha, because you would ask me about the Buddha. The Buddha said that he taught one main thing, and that is that there is suffering and pain and suffering in this world. That is unavoidable. We all know that. We should know that. But there is a liberation from pain and suffering. So he teaches both. There is suffering, but there's hope, and there is a way out. And the star of this story is our attention, and how what we pay attention to shapes which way we go. And so I will give you a story. But I also, maybe as another, I have 2 things to say as a preamble to my story, is that, I'll give you a story and then I'll give you the qualifications. So basically the story is that this was probably around 2007, and I had suffered a breakup with someone, which was very, very painful in my life. And so I remember going to Paris, and a friend of mine gave me this fabulous apartment in the Marais overlooking the canals. It was just amazing. And I was spending my time sobbing on my living room floor. So clearly, Paris didn't do it for me at that time in my life. And so, but I finally remembered, hey, I'm a meditator, and I can use my meditation skills to deal with this emotional suffering, and I did. But I want to say that when you have pain and any kind of pain, physical pain or emotional pain, it doesn't mean that the pain's going to go away entirely. But what it does mean is that the impact of the pain will be diminished and diluted so that it doesn't prevent you from living a full life.
You don't have to be consumed by it.
Exactly. So you don't have to, I mean, it's still there, but you sort of, you know, it shrinks itself
But
down
Paris
to
is
the
there
side.
too.
Yes, 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 yes. But Paris is there too. So you shrink it down to size so that it's manageable, and then I can go out and see Paris. But before that, I was going to make an analogy that when I was suffering from my broken heart, and I make an analogy with a leaf. Like I look at this leaf, and it's like if you hold a leaf up to a night sky that way, the leaf looks larger than the moon. Well, my broken heart was like this leaf. My broken heart was larger than the moon. It was all I saw. And what I did through my mindfulness training was to shrink down this leaf so that it's not so big as the moon. Yes, the leaf is there, but it's one part of the larger picture.
How did you do that?
Okay, so, folks, I'm hoping this is not going to be too technical about attention, but I need to be technical and to be precise. Because attention is like a vast word, we don't know what it means. Okay, so the first part is what initiated my suffering. I was out on a walk, and I saw a man wearing a pair of sandals. And those sandals reminded me, oh, Dan used to wear those sandals. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the image of Dan popped up. It was a fleeting image, but my mind pounced on it. And my mind sort of pounced on it in each of my sensory channels. And this is going to be important about my sensory channels. So what I heard in my mind's ear, what I saw in my mind's eye, what I felt in my body were all humming the same tune of making me feel utterly miserable. So I saw those sandals, I saw Dan, and this bam, 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 and then I heard the lyrics of a song by Madeleine Peyroux, if any of you like her. And the song was Once in a While, the title of the song is called Once in a While. Once in a while I wake up wondering why we gave up. And so then another voice inside of me piped up and I said, yeah, why did we give up? And then I was off and running. Why did we give up? Why did we give up? And then another lyric came to mind. You'll be loved again. And then I said, wrong. And so I'm having creating this whole drama in my sensory experience.
Right.
And then I added a visual track to it. I had the internal movie screen that featured us happily cooking together, and I could taste and smell the food, and then images of myself alone, and then my attention flashed on the physiological sensations in my body, and it felt as if that I was pumping cement into my heart.
Wow.
Which is just really, really hard.
So everything reminded you of Dan.
Right. So the point of my story here is that this is a story of self-pity. I could have just said, I felt sorry for myself, and then there I am on the floor, sobbing. What I did in my effort to convey the story to you is to break it up into its sensory channels. Because our experience is always made up of sensory details. What we see, what we taste, what we hear, what we feel, etc., etc. And the reason why, and it's on the basis of our sensory data that we form concepts. And those are harder to change. And it's easier to deal with data when it's at the sensory level than when it's at the conceptual level. Because, for example, the more my attention floods into a whole panoply of different sensory channels, the fuller my pain is. And so I was taking those stupid sandals of a complete stranger and pumping into it all of these stories based on sensory data I am just completely making up. And so I am pumping up like a leaf into something larger than the moon on the basis of where my attention is going to. So my point here is that in this instance, I had no choice in where my attention went. It just went wild. It fell into its default settings, and it chose to focus on all the things that made my pain heavier and stronger and larger. So okay, now mindfulness. Choose what to focus on. One technique, one very important technique, is to divide and conquer. Because if you have all three sensory channels converging, that is overwhelming. But if you can break up your sensory experience into its component parts and just focus on one, that is manageable. And it's sort of like if you've ever had the experience of watching a television program with the sound turned off. You can see the picture, but when you eliminate the sound, it doesn't grip you. It doesn't, you can see the images flying by, but it doesn't get its hooks into you in the same way. So it flattens the image so you can allow it to go by. Are you following me?
Yes, but I'd like you to be more specific about what you did.
Oh, yeah, I am now. Okay, so, yes, thank you. I am. So I chose one sensory component, and that was what I felt in my body, because the body is the easiest and it's present. And so I focused on, because I had to focus first on what was happening in my heart and on my chest, because I was feeling really heavy. And so what I did was I tracked the activity in my heart, and I was on the lookout for how it changed, not how it was solid, because at first it felt solid and unmoving. And the more solid I might perceive it to be, the heavier it would feel. But I noticed that it would change over time, that sometimes it would let up, it would move location, etc. And the point of this is that the more it changed, the more it became, and the less solid it became, the more it was able to move and dissolve. And it did lessen. It didn't go away, but it lessened. And then the next, and this is the next important point, when it did lessen, because I was just focusing on my physiological sensations, I had more, and I had basically put the auditory and visual in the background. I had more attentional space to notice what else was going on in my body at the same time. And I noticed, oh, wait a minute, I have hands, and I have feet, and they were fine. I could feel the tingle and a buzz in my hands and feet that I didn't know were there, because my attention had all been glomming onto my heart. But I noticed, so that I felt that I could still hold my heavy heart, but in a larger container, so that all of me was not defined by my broken heart. And so this was a kind of really important, this is what my mental gym allowed me to do, because it meant that I could open up the container of my awareness to make it much larger, so that the impact of my broken heart was smaller than it was.
And could you then go out and enjoy Paris without thinking about him constantly?
Yeah. I mean, but let me just give you, definitely. Let me just one more analogy to this. Is it sort of, if you take dye, if you take some dye and you put it in a fishbowl, the whole fishbowl instantly turns red. You take the same amount of dye and you put it in a pond or a lake, there's no impact. And it's the same thing with what we do with our attention, so that when we're in pain, and I did this example with my class students to hold ice cubes in their hand. You know, when you focus all of your attention on your broken heart or your hurting hand or whatever, it defines your whole world. And of course, it's overwhelming. You can't function. But if you enable your attention to notice all the other things that are happening at the same time, then the impact of the pain is still there, but it's reduced to a kind of more annoying, a little hum. And then, to answer your question, yeah, then I felt liberated.
And tell us about that exercise where you're holding ice cubes.
Yeah, so in my classes, when I teach mindfulness as part of my Fiat program, and I do this exercise every year, because it's easier to teach how to deal with physical pain than emotional pain. And so I had students hold ice cubes in their hand, and when they used the regular default settings for how they focus their attention, they couldn't hold it. They just, they were wiped, and they had to drop it. But when I had them, I train their awareness into how to focus their attention on the rest of their bodies. Yes, they felt the pain in their hand, but it was just one part of it.
Wow. So they could hold the ice cubes much longer.
It's sort of like you're putting your pain, are you going to put your pain in the driver's seat or in the back seat? Or in the trunk, you know? And that matters. And so so I guess the reason I wanted to tell these stories is it gives you an example of the kind of training we do with our attention. And reason is not going to help us. Reason alone, you can say, oh, you're being an idiot to think that way. But that's not going to cut it.
May I ask you something else?
Yeah, sure.
So I want to ask you about expectations. You know, and mindfulness. One thing that I've noticed is that very often when my expectations are high for something, I end up disappointed. It could be about almost anything, maybe a movie that everybody's told me is fabulous, and I see it and I think, isn't that good? Or maybe a vacation where I'm thinking this is really going to be spectacular, and then I'm a little disappointed. And then other times when my expectations are lower, I'm often very pleasantly surprised. I think, oh, that movie's pretty good. It's better than I thought it would be, or I really enjoyed this. Is there a connection between expectations and mindfulness, and should we try to push expectations aside because they get us into trouble, or is that a different topic?
No, it is related. We don't have to push them aside because sometimes they're helpful. Okay, sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not. And there's no hard and fast rule. The key here is when you notice that your expectations are not being met, you need to not hold on to them. You let them go. And so what mindfulness training does is it helps you deal with the arising and passing of everything. And the more you grab onto something and the problem isn't the expectation. The problem is that we then we get annoyed and want to make the present into our past imagination of the future. And that's where the real problem comes on when we start to, we're not flexible enough.
And so what do we do about that?
Oh, okay, well, one thing we could do is, like, we can, in the moment, set our intention to find 3 good things that are happening in the conversation. And you know, really, the setting of an intention to find something good is important. Or what I will do is something like, I will change my body posture. I will sit up straight and remind myself, I'm here in this conversation. It's not going the way I wanted it to go. I have a choice. See, I think maybe the key point here is choice. We can very often we have choice, but we don't realize we have a choice. We can just allow the conversation to go the way it's going. Or we can say, you know, I'm really feeling disappointed. Maybe I can look for something consciously that will make it more interesting to me.
Say it to yourself or actually say it aloud to the other person?
Oh, I know, to yourself.
To yourself. Because sometimes I've found in a conversation, if it's not going so well, you can actually talk about the conversation itself rather than what you had been talking about and say, you know what, I really was hoping to do with this conversation.
Yes.
Get into this.
Yes, sure. Depends on the conversation,
right,
on the of your relationship.
Yeah.
Sure, but I think the main point is to realize you have choices. And we forget that we have choices. I mean, it's most of the time we have no idea we don't have a choice. That wait, I think I goofed that sentence. We have no idea. If we don't have a choice, look, we don't have a choice if we don't realize we have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to remind ourselves that we have choices and then figure out what would they be in that context. And I notice sometimes when I find myself getting bored, I can't change them. I change my posture. I sit up and when I'm bored, it's usually like slouched in my chair. And I just sit up and then I tune, I know what I do. I tune in rather than tune out. Because if I'm bored, my tendency is to tune out.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting about choices. You know, when Will Smith hit Chris Rock at the Academy Awards, afterwards I read that Will Smith said he often regrets decisions that he makes, and he realizes, but forgets at the time, that he has choices, that sometimes he's done foolish things, and afterwards he said to himself, why did I do that? I didn't have to do that. But at the time, somehow you don't think about it.
Yeah. Maybe someone from the audience has some questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get to that very soon, but actually there's just 1 or 2 last things, and then I want to hear your question. So one thing is, last week we had a travel program. Crystal Aragon, and I think you worked with Crystal, on a UCLA alumni travel, where there's often
some people
a
who have been
professor.
on the trips, yeah.
Okay, so maybe you'll say something about that. But one thing about travel I want to ask you is how to be a more mindful traveler. Sometimes we've been on tours, travel tours, where we go to different countries, and by the end of the tour, people kind of get confused about what they saw and in which destination. You know, it reminds me of the title of an old movie, if it's Tuesday, this must be Belgium. How can you be more mindful and remember, oh, this was here and this was there?
I have not done what I'm going to suggest, but Stuart asked me this question the other day, and I was thinking about it. That's a great idea. I think what I'm going to do on my upcoming trip is suggest to everyone in my group that they set their intention every single day to find 3 interesting things during that day, and then ask them to maybe invite those people to dinner, because we often go out to dinner together, and then everyone share with each other what they found interesting. And I think that would be a really great way of doing it, because when you set your intention to have a positive mindset, that's what you find. And oh, I should say, I tried this with my students, I forgot. I told them when they go into every class, they should set their intention before the class to find 3 interesting things. And they reported that it transformed their experience. They said they
found it, classes they hated, they came to love. Classes that confused them, all of a sudden, because they focused their attention differently, they understood things they hadn't understood before because they were so, I think maybe it was that they were so worried about getting the material. But if you ask a different question, what do you find interesting? It's a different kind of question that maybe makes them feel more relaxed. So my students universally said it made a huge difference when they remembered. They didn't always remember. So and I try to do that. I keep a journal and I do that. What are things that I find interesting?
So you told us that mindfulness has many benefits for our lives. I mean, you certainly convinced me we should be more mindful. I should be more mindful. So I want to ask you a little bit more about how to actually do it. So, what I've heard is that people concentrate on their breathing. Just think, I'm inhaling, I'm exhaling, and see if you can do that for 20 minutes or even 5 minutes. You were starting this program by talking about, okay, pay attention to the sounds in the room. If you're eating one of our chocolate chip cookies, pay attention to the sensation. So tell us more about how you actually do it, how long it lasts. Do you do it every day, for how long? And also, what I'd like to understand better is the connection between doing that, paying attention to your breathing, to the sounds in the room, and how that then enables you to get all these benefits that you've been talking about.
Okay, great, thanks. First of all, to just repeat something that Stuart said, the standard view is to have you pay attention to your breath. You don't have to pay. If you like paying attention to your breath, fine, that's great. But it doesn't really matter what you pay attention to. Anything is fine. As long as it is present. And you might want to pay attention to something that is relevant. So, but you can pay attention to sounds. I found that sounds are easier. I found sounds are easiest. I had my students go on a walking meditation tour of UCLA, and several of my students said, I didn't know there were birds at UCLA. Because we don't pay attention to our world because we're so busy thinking about other things. So you can do eating that what you can do is you can pay attention to the first bite of everything you eat, the first sip of tea. Because after a while it becomes harder. But it depends on what interests you. You should pick what you love, not what you think you should pick. And so it doesn't really matter. Sounds are good. Okay, so that made that point. Anything that is present. And a number of people find it difficult to focus on their breath for lots of reasons. But the other thing I would say about the training is that it's really a good idea to do it consistently. And I would suggest doing it consistently for 5 minutes a day. Because if other people recommend 20 minutes, my experience is that if 20 minutes is just too long of a time for someone for someone who's a beginner.
My mind wanders.
Well, of course your mind will wander, and that's not a problem. I'll hold that thought. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a minute. And your mind will wander. Even for a minute, it will wander, and that's okay. But you should do what I did. Yeah. So what I did is I had a friend, and he told me he made a commitment to himself to do it for 5 minutes every day for a month without questioning it, without evaluating, just doing it as a thought experiment. And at the end of the month, ask yourself, what has been its impact? Has it helped me in any way? You may not think that the experience of the mindfulness is helpful because it may be boring to you. But the way to judge is notice your behavior. Do you notice any changes in your behavior after a month? Are you kinder? Are you nicer? Are you more relaxed? Or do you enjoy things more? Or just sort of compare your behavior in relation to the way you were in the previous month. If you see any change, that's a good sign.
What did your friend conclude after the month?
He told me that, and then I did it myself.
Oh.
And I concluded that I did not get as, I'm trying to remember because it was a long time ago, but I just felt that I was more, I was probably kinder, not, I was just kinder, less judgmental, less judgmental, and when you are more attentive to something, this is going to get something that I know you're interested in. When you're more attentive to something, you care more about the thing. And it's true in relationships too. The more attentive you are, the more you feel loving. Because attention is a form of love. We don't think of it that way, but it really is.
An act of kindness or even love, yeah.
Yeah, because it shows you care. So attention is a form of caring and a form of love. And we, just coming back to what I said earlier, I think we are not taught to value attention as a valuable resource. We give it away without even knowing it. And we need to reclaim it and own it and nurture it, and it will make us more caring people, because attention is a form of caring and a form of love.
And it sounded like you wanted to say something else about what to do when your mind wanders.
Oh, right, thank you. I carry them around all the time, so don't mind me. Sorry, Bonnie. Yeah. One of the problems with mindfulness is that we think that when our minds wander, which is what they will do, there's something wrong with us, we're no good at it, and we give up. That's probably one of the most common reasons for why people don't continue. But our minds wander. It is not necessarily bad. What the mindfulness does is it shows you, oh, my mind wandered. Thank you for letting me know. And then pull it back.
Just make a note of it and come back.
Yeah, don't beat up on yourself, which I of course did that a lot. But, it's only after a few decades I'm finally beginning to make peace with the fact that my mind wanders, and it will wander more or less at different times. So it's just what the mind does. We don't have one-track minds. And so, but what is important is to acknowledge the wandering and then bring it back to whatever is anchoring your attention. And that's how, okay, and the way to think of it is when you go to a gym, and you are lifting weights or whatever, and you need resistance bands or weights, because you build the strength of your muscle through that resistance, right? Your mind wandering is a form of resistance, and every time you bring your attention back to the initial anchor, you are building your strength.
You're working on it.
It's a form of, so you could say, resistance building, so that you incorporate the problem into the strengthening process.
I see that. And what are the logistics of your mindfulness? Are you sitting in it with your eyes closed in a yoga pose?
No. I have a bad back, and I do it in a chair. But you couldn't do
Eyes closed?
Depends. I can do it eyes closed, eyes open. It depends on, see, now I'm more sophisticated in my exercises. And so some are eyes closed, some are eyes open. But I can do it during other activities as well. When I do photography. So I naturally do a form of mindfulness when I'm walking around and looking for what's going to capture my attention. So I have to be, yeah, and Lisa here knows about that. You know, that I have to be, you need to be still, to be open to subtle things, because if your mind is busy, you don't have enough attentional energy to devote to other things. So that there is mindful, but it's helpful to have mindfulness in a mental gym, separate from the world, so that when you go out into the external world, your attentional muscles are already stronger, so that it's easier to do. So my advice would be not to try to do it in life first, because it's just too hard, and just go to your room. 5 minutes.
Well, those are my questions. You've been listening to us for more than an hour. Let's hear your questions. Yes.
I've always wondered if childhood memories are so cherished because children are able to be mindful and they can look at a doll or a conversation or the first time they've gone somewhere or some kind of food. Because you always hear about beloved childhood memories more than aspects of your life. And I think when I look back on it, I was so mindful for so long over like a dress or something like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And a lot of people have written about the wonder, and that there's a kind of awe and wonder and fascination and attention that children have that we lose as adults because we become too concerned with our to-do list or whatever. I remember a 9-year-old child who, for an hour, turned the light switch off and on. What a dolphin, because he was sort of amazed that when he presses this flip, oh, the light goes on, the switch is here, the light's there. So there's this sense of attention. Okay, so attention, when it's intensified, becomes awe and wonder. And it's magical and mysterious. And, and so when one talks about mindfulness as being, you might think of it as being mystical. It isn't mystical in any kind of necessarily religious sense. But, awe is the beginning of a mystical experience. But it starts with attention. Does that make sense to you? It's sort of like all on a continuum, and children naturally have it. But we lose it. And so in some sense, what the training is to recapture it.
Who else? Vicky.
Sara, we were sitting next to each other at one of the Emeriti dinners and talking about mindfulness. And I started talking about meditation. You said, no, that's different. Do you want to talk about that for a second? Because it's hard to, there's a difference.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. The difference between mindfulness and meditation is different or the same depending upon who you ask, and it's full of controversy. And I don't even remember that. The reason a lot of people prefer the term mindful to meditation is that meditation suggests a religious context. And mindfulness suggests a more scientific context that is more acceptable to our secular culture. And so I think that scientists have struggled to separate it out from the religious. But ultimately, it goes to the same place. It is the same thing. But I think that to get legitimacy and acceptability,
Thank you.
we talk about mindfulness But it's interesting that I happen to mention it in the context of the awe and wonder. I mean, awe and wonder can be scientific, everyday experience, or mystical experience.
Professor Mitchell.
I'm wondering if you see some connection with sleep, particularly the dream stage, because there it's entirely internal. You're making up the dream, even if you're making it up out of some past experience. And you're obviously focused on that. You're not getting external senses and so on, unless some really loud noise wakes you up or something. But it is a kind of very much internal thing. Your attention is on what you're creating.
There's a lot of work on what they call lucid dreaming, which I'm not very familiar with. But is your question, are dreams a form of meditation? Is that
Yeah, sort of, yeah. I mean, are you doing it without, without being told how to do it because it's just inherent in the experience?
It could be, I don't know, I haven't thought about it that much, and it's interesting, but I think that a lot of things that we do in life are inherently mindful, like artists or scholars. When you become so fully absorbed in what you're doing, and all of your attention is streamlined into that activity, and you lose track of time. That's mindfulness. And that's, but we would call that like a peak high. and so as I mentioned earlier, it happens automatically for a lot of people, but we would like to have more of that when we want, and we can recreate it when we want, but I don't, but with the dreams, I think that dreams don't have that consciousness going on.
Oh, but if I may follow up on what Dr. Mitchell asked. So, you're talking about attention, and during the day, the days are often very hectic. We're rushing around, going from place to place, doing all these things, and our attention is sometimes going in many different directions. And then, at night, when you're finally resting and sleeping, certain things come into your mind, and it seems like the dream is maybe either calling your attention to something that's important, or, it's certainly, I think, highlighting something that maybe during the day you didn't have enough time to think about, and it's kind of reminding you, it's making you think. It seems to me maybe there is a connection between, what you're thinking about and...
Oh yeah, no, that's clear. I think there is, because very often dreams pick up on details from everyday life.
Who else? Yes.
Thank you. I was curious about your book on mindfulness and tango. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Wow, okay. I'll try to give a very short description of it. One of the things I talk about is how tango is one of those activities that naturally teaches mindfulness, because it's a distinctive dance in that there is absolutely no pattern. I can start with my left foot, my right foot. I may move front, side, back, diagonal for 1 beat, 8 beats, 16 beats. I never know in advance how it's going to be. So you have to be totally present in the moment to feel what's happening, because there's no pre-established patterns. And when you have expectations, which is of how the pattern's going to be, then that moves everything up. And so that's just the baseline of it. If you're interested, I'm thrilled you asked the question. I'd love to talk with you more.
Oh, great.
But there's a ton of stuff about activities in life that teach mindfulness, and we become better at them when we are mindful. We become better at everything when we're mindful. It's, we were talking, Stuart and I, everything is included. There's not an aspect of life it doesn't impact.
Let's take one or two more.
Can mindfulness help someone who is suffering depression?
Yes.
And how can that be done?
Yes, I'm not an expert in it, but there are, I should say first that there are lots of therapists who use mindfulness to help with depression. And I'm not an expert, but I think that the more you cultivate attention, there is a form of caring about something, so that you know, you can, and this is something I taught my students, we tend to think of caring as something that either you have it or don't. You care for something or you don't. But actually caring about something, and love even, is a skill. And it's trainable. And you can, like there's a practice in mindfulness called loving kindness, and I practice that. And I practiced, and I taught one of my students this too, is that I just really focused on developing a greater caring for my students, which transformed my teaching. The content didn't change, I don't think. But what changed was I came to care more about my students because of my loving kindness practice. And that the more I cared about my students, that made me feel happier and more engaged. Does this make sense to you?
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that, you know, yeah, I'm just going to repeat what I said, because I think it's really important. Caring is a skill. And you can, and just like I said to you at the very beginning of this session, set your intention to notice 3 interesting things. Then you find yourself noticing those things. And so then it kind of feeds on itself. And so you set your intention to like 3 things. You don't even have to use the word like, that might be too loaded. Just find it interesting.
And this is our last question.
Yes. I wonder if you could expand on what you do to show caring for your students or to make yourself more caring. There's so many aspects of caring. You know, when someone's just sick and you call them at home, or what you do.
Wow, my God. Wow, that's an interesting question. Well, because I did notice a difference over time as I did do this practice. I just seemed happier to talk to them, wanted to know more about them. I always remember their names, remember what they tell me. Try to figure out what their strengths are and help them find ways to build on their strengths. And so the caring and the attention would show up as my noticing the strengths of their observations in class. And so I noticed in class you said this kind of thing. It shows you're interested in, or, you know, I remember what they say and link it to a strength of theirs. So it's not, so teaching isn't simply about the content of the course material. It's about more than that. It's about trying to figure out how they think and operate in the world and teach them. Because very often they have no idea what strengths they have. They have no clue. Because nobody, well, I'll make certain observations about them. They don't know. But, you know, I have a different perspective. So I guess to answer your question, which I never thought about, so thank you for that, is I pay attention to what their comments and behavior reveals more deeply about them.
And thank you for your attention, and thank you very much, Professor Sara Melzer. Thank you for all those wise insights.